my simple servlet here that's extending the HTTP servlet. So I'll show you a trick that can help you really understand what's going on behind the scenes here. Here you can actually open up the code for HTTP servlet by pressing Control and then clicking on the name. I assume you have downloaded the Tomcat source and linked it to Eclipse. I have mentioned that in my previous tutorial. If you haven't done that, just go ahead and do that and then come back to this tutorial. Once you do that, you will be able to do this. Just Control click on this class name and you actually open up a class. So this is the source code of the HTTP servlet as implemented by Tomcat. Now here you can see HTTP servlet extends the generic servlet. We've already seen that. Now I can do a control click on the generic servlet and I open up the generic servlet code itself. You can see here generic servlet is implementing servlet and ServletConfig. We don't have to worry about that as of now. Let's just look at the inheritance pattern. So we have the HTTP servlet here and the generic servlet here. So let's look at the generic servlet. We'll start with this one first. So go to the outline tab, you can see all the methods that the generic servlet has. So there are a lot of methods which we have not seen here, but we'll look at the ones that we are talking about now. We have the init ServletConfig. There you go. So we already spoke about this. Init method takes an object of ServletConfig as a parameter and see what it does. It does a this.config equals config. So it's actually having a member called config and then it's placing the input config value into this config. And then it's actually calling the blank init method, the init method without any parameters. This is again another thing that we saw. So what does this init method without parameters do? It does nothing. So we'll come back to this. We'll try to understand why this is done. Why are we calling a method that actually does not do anything? So, but as far as the init method is concerned, what it does, it takes this parameter, ServletConfig parameter. We don't know what this is yet, but it's taking this config parameter and then it's putting it into its own member variable. That's all that the init does. So this config is actually handed over to this by Tomcat. We'll look at what this config is and how we can use it later. But for now, this is what the init method does. So this is the first method that gets executed when the object is created. We have the config passed to it and it saves the config in its own member variable. Next, now we get a request. Now the service method has to run. Now here's the service method. The service method takes two parameters. One is the servlet request and one is the servlet response. Now what does it do? It does not do anything. Again, the service method we saw is actually implemented, the core implementation is in the HTTP servlet class because it takes care of the HTTP protocol specific activities. But the service method has been defined in the generic servlet and it just has the interface defined, it does not do anything. So now we'll look at the HTTP servlet class. Now the HTTP servlet class does not override the init. You can see there's no init method here, but it does have the service method overridden. So let's have a look at what it does. The service method takes the servlet request and the servlet response, and then it defines two variables called the HTTP servlet and the HTTP servlet request and the HTTP servlet response. It takes the input request and response and then it casts it into HTTP servlet request and HTTP servlet response. So this HTTP servlet class assumes that the request and the response that it's getting is actually of type HTTP servlet request and HTTP servlet response, which is fair enough because we know that this HTTP servlet class deals with HTTP protocol. So the request and response that it gets is also HTTP. So if it is not, then it throws an exception saying it's a non-HTTP request. So hey, this is not related to HTTP protocols at all. Why are you calling me? It just throws an exception and it gets out of this execution. But if this casting is fine, works fine, then it actually calls another service method here. But this does not take the servlet request and the servlet response notice. It takes these two objects, which are the HTTP servlet request and the HTTP servlet response. So behind the scenes, HTTP servlet class implements another service method, but this one takes the HTTP servlet request and the HTTP servlet response. So let's have a look at that method here. There you go. Here is a service method with HTTP servlet request and HTTP servlet response. Let's see what this does. That's fairly straightforward. It takes the method from the request object. HTTP request servlet request has a get method, so it gets the method, and then it checks if it's a do get. Then it calls the do get. If it is head, then it calls a do head. If it's a post, it calls a do post, and so on. There are a few other things that's happening over here, but you don't have to worry about it. All you need to know is that based on the request, it's calling the do get and the do post and so on. And now what does the do get and the do post do here? We've already seen this in our previous tutorial. Let's pull up the do get, let's pull up the do post, etc. So the do post just prints a message saying the method not allowed or a bad request depending on the protocol here. So all it does is in summary it just throws an error. So we do not want this to run. So if we anticipate a do post execution, if we anticipate that there is a do post request which happens to the servlet, then we need to override it. So we have do post in our servlet class so that that does not run. The service method that we saw earlier, this guy here, it checks this and it calls the do get or the do post. Yes, it calls the do get if it's a get, or a do post if it's a post. So when it does that, we will supply those methods so that our methods, the do get of our servlet or the do post of our servlet runs, and that's what will process the request and return the response. And of course, you must have noticed the do post takes the request and the response, and that's what's actually coming to us. So this is the piece of the code that is actually sending us these values. So here, do get is actually passing the request and the response by casting that in a previous method. So we get this request and the response of HTTP servlet request and HTTP servlet response. We use it for our processing. Now hopefully the whole picture is clear. Okay, so we learned about the init method and the service method. The service method is not something that we would use or override often, but the init method has a very good purpose. Since we know that that's the first method that runs when the servlet is, the servlet object is initiated, we can override the init method to write code there which we want to run when the servlet object is created for the first time. So any initialization code, like opening a database connection or something like that, can be done in the init method, which is overridden. So what we need to do is we need to override the init method here. We need to override the init method here, but we need to make sure that if we override it, we either call the super init method, we need to call this, or we need to make sure that we are taking this config parameter that we're getting and we're putting it in as a member variable, because this is a very important thing that the init method does. Even though we don't know what this config is right now, we should note that this is something that is passed to us by Tomcat, and then init method by default puts it into a member variable so that it's accessible in our server. So this .config can be used here. So we can use the config object in our do-get, but if we override this init method with our own init method, we need to make sure that this is happening, otherwise we will lose the config object that we get. So just to avoid all this, what we do is instead of overriding this init method which takes the config parameter, we can override the init method here which does not take a parameter. We know that this is called because this init method calls this init method. The method which takes the parameter calls a method which does not take a parameter. So this is kind of like a utility method that has been introduced, which makes it easy to override, or where we do not need the servlet config. So either way, if you override this, you don't have to worry about the servlet config. We know that the base init method takes this property and saves it in a member variable, and then we can freely override this with whatever we want. So again, a common use case would be if you're creating a database connection. You want to override the init method in your servlet and create a database connection. But of course, you should remember that this is not something that you execute across servlets. Every servlet will have its own init method. So you need to do something that is specific to this servlet alone. So another thing that we as the end product of this init method is of course the ServletConfig. So what is the ServletConfig? It is some configuration values that you can predefine, and this ServletConfig object will contain that configuration parameter. So let's say, for example, I want to have a username being passed to this servlet as as a standard variable. Instead of doing all this, when I'm taking this username as a parameter, I want it to be by default a particular value, so that whenever the servlet starts, that username will be available inside the servlet. So what I'll do now is I'll have a string as the default username, and I'll set it initially in the servlet itself, and even if there are no parameters that are passed, the requests and the session and the context would be null, but the value will be there by default in the servlet context. So in order to set a value, I can use annotations here. So along with these properties here, I can add something called as init parameters equals. So here I can add as many parameters as I want here, and I need to give an annotation at web init param name equals user value that equals John Doe. This will set the default user parameter to the value John Doe. Okay, now we initialized the init params, and I have one parameter here called the default user, and the value is John Doe. Now, in order to use this value in our methods, we need to use the ServletConfig. We have seen this in our init method explanation in our generic servlet class. We saw that there is a ServletConfig object that's passed to the default init method. So this default init method puts the ServletConfig object into the config member of the class. So this member will be available for us as well. So we can access this by using this .get ServletConfig. So this will give us the ServletConfig, and this ServletConfig has a get init parameter method. So this get init parameter method can be used to pull up this value. So as long as I pass this name value here, I can get the response as well. So this will give us the initial value that we have set here, John Doe.